The late afternoon light filtered through the rafters of Blackwater's auction barn, casting long shadows across sawdust and expectation. Jeremiah Briggs stood center stage, arms spread wide like a revival preacher, silver belt buckle catching the dying sun. His weather-beaten face creased deeper with each word, voice carrying to the highest beams. Thunderstrike pawed the ground beside him, 18 hands of midnight fury, with eyes that burned like coals. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his obsidian coat, nostrils flared wide, drinking in the fear that wafted from the crowd. 3 seasons they'd watched him, 3 seasons of broken bones and shattered pride. The audience shifted in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of anticipation. They'd all heard the stories, how Thunderstrike had thrown Mick Sanders clear across the arena last spring, how Pete Wilkins still walked with a limp after his attempt. There was something unnatural about the horse, they whispered, not born wild, but made that way by something no one dared ask about anymore. Jeremiah's voice cut through the murmurs, gravel soaked in whiskey and authority. 10 seconds, that's all it would take. 10 seconds on Thunderstrike's back, and the magnificent beast would belong to whoever had the courage. The challenge hung in the air, impossible and tempting all at once. Wade Connors leaned against the fence post, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. His eyes narrowed as they met Silas Reed's questioning glance from across the arena. Beside them, Emmett Vaughn crossed his arms tight against his chest, the sleeves of his worn flannel stretching across forearms thick from decades of ranch work. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Every man in Blackwater knew Thunderstrike's reputation wasn't myth, it was warning. The crowd stirred, whispers passing like wind through tall grass. Someone laughed nervously, the sound dying quick in the charged air. Jeremiah stood tall beside his impossible horse, his kingdom built on dares no one could meet, challenges he knew would go unanswered. His authority remained unchallenged in this dirt circle that had witnessed 20 years of his reign. Then the shift came, subtle as a change in weather. A figure moved near the back, where shadows gathered thick against the wall, slender and unhurried, parting the crowd like a blade through water. Boots that had seen miles left careful impressions in the sawdust, moving with deliberate purpose. Jeremiah's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition perhaps, or the first tremor of doubt. Wade straightened slightly from his slouch. Silas uncrossed his arms, and Emmett's perpetual frown deepened into something more curious than dismissive. The impossible challenge suddenly felt different, charged with something beyond the usual theater of Jeremiah's auctions. As the figure stepped fully into the light, the Blackwater barn fell silent, holding its collective breath for what would come next. The arena dust swirled around Morgan Ellis's boots as she stepped into the light. Her faded denim jacket hung loose across narrow shoulders, intricate turquoise beading catching the barn's harsh illumination like forgotten stars. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, practical, nothing wasted. The crowd's murmurs faded to a low hum of disbelief. Women didn't challenge Thunderstrike. Most men with sense didn't either. Wade Connors moved first, shifting toward Jeremiah, with urgency in his step. He leaned in close, lips barely moving, as he whispered something urgent against the auctioneer's ear. A warning, perhaps, or a plea for sanity. Jeremiah's trademark smirk faltered for just a heartbeat before resettling with practiced ease. Morgan didn't acknowledge the stares that followed her. Her eyes remained fixed on Thunderstrike, as if the crowd, the barn, the whole of Blackwater had dissolved into insignificance. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull, muscles coiling beneath his midnight coat. He pawed violently at the ground, sending clods of dirt flying toward the observers in the front row. Silas Reed backed away a step. Emmett Vaughn didn't move, but his expression darkened. They'd seen what came next before. The charge, the fury, the inevitable humiliation for anyone foolish enough to approach the beast without Jeremiah's careful hand restraining him. Yet Morgan walked forward, with the steady rhythm of someone returning, rather than arriving. Her posture betrayed no fear, no hesitation, just the calm certainty of reclaiming something known. When she reached the midpoint of the arena, time itself seemed to slow. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed, his weathered face suddenly pale beneath his tan. Something about her, the tilt of her chin perhaps, or the way her right hand rested on her hip, struck him like physical pain. Memory clawed at the edges of his carefully constructed present, images he'd buried beneath 20 years of auctions and reputation. Morgan approached Thunderstrike with her palm extended flat, stopping just beyond the reach of his teeth. The stallion's nostrils flared wide, drinking in her scent with violent suspicion. His massive chest heaved with each breath, poised between attack and retreat. She leaned forward then, lips moving in words too soft for anyone to hear. Whatever she whispered carried only to the horse's flickering ears, which suddenly pricked forward in response. The transformation wasn't dramatic. Thunderstrike didn't suddenly calm or soften, but something shifted in the animal's posture. Recognition, impossible as it seemed. Jeremiah's hand gripped the fence rail until his knuckles whitened. His throat worked visibly as he swallowed whatever emotion had risen unbidden. Wade watched him with growing concern while Silas and Emmett exchanged glances loaded with unspoken questions. The stranger in denim stood steady before Blackwater's most dangerous legend, and for the first time in years, Jeremiah Briggs looked truly afraid, not of the horse, but of the woman, of what her presence might unearth from the carefully packed soil of his past, of truths he'd convinced himself were buried too deep to ever see daylight again. Time slowed to a crawl as Morgan's palm made contact with Thunderstrike's velvet muzzle. The connection between them rippled through the arena like electricity, invisible but undeniable. The stallion's muscles twitched beneath his obsidian coat, but the expected explosion never came. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring with each deep breath as Morgan's fingers traced the white blaze running down his face. Wade Connors shifted his weight, boot heels grinding into the packed dirt. Silas Reed leaned forward, squinting as if trying to make sense of a mirage. Emmett Vaughn's perpetual scowl deepened into something like wonder. None of them had ever seen Thunderstrike allow a touch without violence following. Morgan moved with quiet confidence, reaching for the saddle that Silas had dropped over the fence rail. The leather creaked as she lifted it, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed barn. She approached Thunderstrike's side, movements slow and deliberate, placing the saddle on his back with the care of someone handling fragile memory. The audience held its collective breath. Thunderstrike had thrown saddles and handlers before, spinning and kicking until equipment lay scattered and broken, but now he stood still, ears flickering back and forth, as if listening to words only he could hear. His skin twitched beneath the saddle blanket, but nothing more. Jeremiah's facade began to crack at the edges. The confident smirk that had defined his face for 2 decades slipped, revealing something raw underneath. His hands gripped the fence rail, knuckles white, a fine tremor running through them. Silas noticed, his eyes narrowing at the auctioneer's uncharacteristic display of nerves. When Morgan placed her boot in the stirrup and swung herself onto Thunderstrike's back, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The great stallion stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, processing this new weight, this new reality. Then he reared, powerful and sudden, front hooves pawing at the air 15 feet above the ground. Morgan didn't panic. She didn't clutch at the saddle horn or cry out. Her body moved with Thunderstrike's, balanced and centered, as if they shared the same heartbeat. When he came crashing back to earth, she remained seated, her posture unchanged, her hand gentle on his neck. Thunderstrike circled the arena, his gait smooth and controlled under Morgan's guidance. She didn't use the reins to dominate or command. They hung loose in her hands, unnecessary. The stallion responded to shifts in her weight, to whispered words that didn't carry beyond his twitching ears. The crowd watched in stunned silence as horse and rider moved in harmony, cutting perfect circles in the dust. This wasn't the hard-won obedience of a broken spirit. This was recognition, deep and primal. Memory lived in muscle and bone. Jeremiah's eyes never left Morgan's face. His expression had gone from disbelief to something darker, more haunted. He seemed smaller somehow, shoulders hunched against a weight only he could feel. The proud auctioneer, who had challenged the world just minutes before now, looked like a man watching his carefully constructed reality crumble into dust. As Morgan guided Thunderstrike toward the center of the arena, the impossible truth began to dawn on the spectators. The unrideable horse had found his rider, or perhaps had remembered her. Morgan slid from Thunderstrike's back with the easy grace of someone returning home. Her boots hit the dirt with a soft thud that echoed through the silent barn. No applause followed her performance. No cheers broke the heavy stillness. The audience sensed something deeper than horsemanship unfolding before them, something raw and personal that made them witnesses rather than spectators. She stood center arena, one hand resting on Thunderstrike's neck, the stallion unnaturally calm beside her. Her eyes never left Jeremiah's face as she crossed the distance between them, each step deliberate, measured, like a predator closing in on prey long-tracked. The proud auctioneer didn't move from his post by the fence, but something in his posture had changed. Shoulders rigid, jaw tight, eyes darting as if searching for escape. When Morgan reached him, the space between them charged with 20 years of absence, she spoke words that carried to every corner of the hushed barn. Her voice didn't waver as she named herself, Morgan Ellis, daughter of Catherine, the woman Jeremiah had loved then left behind when her belly swelled with his child, the woman who died waiting for a return that never came. The crowd's collective intake of breath was sharp, painful. Wade Connors took a step back, running weathered fingers through his gray hair. Silas Reed and Emmett Vaughn exchanged glances loaded with dawning comprehension. Everyone in Blackwater knew Catherine Ellis's story, the young horse trainer who disappeared after a broken heart. But no one had connected her to Jeremiah. No one had dared. Thunderstrike pawed at the ground behind her, his presence now making terrible sense. The stallion had been Catherine's pride, her masterwork. Jeremiah had taken him when he vanished. Another piece of her ripped away. The horse everyone believed unrideable simply hadn't found the right rider. Until the daughter with her mother's hands, her mother's voice, her mother's way with creatures who remembered love. Jeremiah's carefully constructed world crumbled visibly. The proud stance, the easy authority, the untouchable legend, all stripped away in seconds, leaving only a man haunted by his own choices. His throat worked, swallowing words that wouldn't come. His hands, once steady enough to command any auction, trembled at his sides. Morgan hadn't come for forgiveness. She hadn't come for Thunderstrike, though his recognition had confirmed what she already knew. She'd come for acknowledgement, for Jeremiah to face the truth he'd spent decades burying beneath success and reputation. The daughter he'd never claimed stood before him now, carrying her mother's eyes and her own fury, quiet and controlled. The crowd remained frozen, caught between voyeuristic fascination and the uncomfortable feeling of witnessing something deeply private. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was reckoning, blood and history rising through packed dirt that had absorbed too many secrets. In the oppressive silence, Jeremiah Briggs, the man whose voice had commanded respect across 3 counties, found himself wordless, defenseless against the living proof of his greatest cowardice. The challenge he'd issued earlier hung forgotten in the air, replaced by the ultimate challenge of facing the daughter whose existence he'd denied for 20 years. Blackwater changed overnight, the town's steady rhythm disrupted by truth, finally spoken aloud. Whispers followed Morgan Ellis as she moved through the general store, the post office, the diner on Main Street. Conversations stalled when she entered rooms, then rekindled in urgent murmurs once she passed. Her name became currency, traded alongside stories of Catherine Ellis that had lain dormant for 2 decades. Morgan took a small room above Wade Connor's tack shop, Spartan and impersonal like the many temporary spaces she'd inhabited before. Thunderstrike occupied the largest stall in Wade's stable, his powerful presence drawing curious onlookers who kept their distance, watching the untamable stallion who now followed Morgan's movements with attentive eyes. In the quiet of evening, when the stable emptied of workers and gossips, Morgan would sit on an overturned bucket beside Thunderstrike's stall. The stallion would lower his great head, ears pricked toward her voice as she spoke of things she shared with no one else. Her words flowed like water over stones, worn smooth by years of carrying them alone. She told him about growing up in the shadow of absence, about searching for her father's features in her own reflection, about Catherine teaching her to ride bareback across open fields, their horses flying beneath summer skies, about watching her mother work 3 jobs, fingers cracked and bleeding in winter, pride never allowing her to ask for help, about Catherine's eyes always drifting toward the horizon, looking for someone who never returned. Thunderstrike listened in the way only creatures who carry memory in their bones can listen. Sometimes he would nick her softly, or press his velvet muzzle against her shoulder, as if absorbing her words directly through his skin. Those moments were the only times Morgan's carefully constructed walls showed cracks. Across town, behind the imposing gates of his ranch house, Jeremiah Briggs retreated from public view. The man who had commanded attention at every gathering now avoided the diner, the feed store, the weekly poker game at Emmett's. His absence was as conspicuous as Morgan's presence, creating a void where once authority stood. In the dark of his study, surrounded by auction records and championship ribbons, Jeremiah sat with a bottle of whiskey that emptied too quickly and refilled too often. The weight of 20 years pressed against his chest, heavier than any bronco that had ever thrown him. The respect he'd cultivated, the legend he'd built around himself, all of it now viewed through the lens of what he'd hidden. Silas Reed reported that business at the auction house had slowed. People still came, but something had changed in how they looked at Jeremiah, how they spoke to him. Questions lingered unasked in their eyes. The story of Morgan Ellis spread through neighboring counties like wildfire, reaching places where Catherine's name had once been known. Jeremiah's hands, once steady enough to command any crowd, now trembled when he lifted his glass. The mirror above his fireplace reflected a stranger, older, smaller somehow, diminished by the truth he could no longer outrun. The daughter he'd never acknowledged had accomplished what no man or beast had managed in 20 years. She'd unseated the great Jeremiah Briggs from his self-constructed throne of certainty. Outside his window, Blackwater continued its quiet revolution, reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the man who had defined their town for so long. The morning dew still clung to the grass when Jeremiah Briggs called his lawyer to the ranch house. The older man arrived with briefcase in hand, confusion etched across his brow as Jeremiah laid out his intentions with a voice that carried no room for argument. By afternoon, papers were drawn and signed, ink still drying on decisions 20 years overdue. The Blackwater Auction Ranch would no longer bear only Briggs' name. It would belong to Morgan Ellis, daughter unclaimed, but undeniable. Wade Connors received the envelope with wary eyes, tucking it carefully inside his worn leather vest before making the short ride to his own stables. He found Morgan brushing Thunderstrike's gleaming coat, her movements methodical, soothing. The stallion stood unnaturally still under her care, head lowered in an acceptance he showed no other human. Wade approached slowly, boots crunching on scattered hay, the weight of Jeremiah's offering heavy in his pocket. Morgan received the deed with hands that didn't tremble, though something shifted behind her eyes As she unfolded the crisp paper, the property line she'd never walked, the house she'd never entered, the legacy she'd never claimed, all suddenly reduced to legal language, and her name printed in stark black ink. Her fingers traced the boundaries drawn on the attached map, territory both foreign and strangely familiar. She said nothing to Wade, merely nodded once before tucking the papers inside her jacket, close to her heart or far from sight, perhaps both. That evening, she saddled Thunderstrike without explanation and rode toward the western boundary of what was now, by law, if not by history, her land. The stallion moved beneath her with quiet power, hooves carving temporary testimony into soil that had known her mother's touch. They crossed creek beds where Catherine had once watered her own horses, crested hills where she had watched sunsets with dreams still intact. Thunderstrike needed no guidance, his memory of these paths evident in every confident stride. Perhaps he too was remembering another rider, another time when these fields promised different futures. Morgan stopped at the highest point overlooking the valley, the auction house, a distant structure catching the day's last light. Thunderstrike's ears flicked back toward her as she sat motionless in the saddle, allowing herself to absorb the contradiction of this inheritance. The land represented everything stolen, her mother's happiness, her own birthright, the years that could never be reclaimed. Yet it also offered something unexpected, roots where before there had been only drifting, connection where there had been only absence. The property deed couldn't restore what Jeremiah's abandonment had broken. It couldn't rewrite Catherine's struggles, or Morgan's childhood spent searching for belonging. But as Morgan watched shadows lengthen across what was now hers by right and recognition both, she felt the first fragile bridge forming between past and future, between wound and potential healing. The land couldn't forgive Jeremiah Briggs, but perhaps, in time, it could reclaim Morgan Ellis. The third Sunday after Morgan's arrival, Blackwater shifted from whispers to open stares. She felt them while tying Thunderstrike outside the general store, the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing against her spine like physical hands. Inside, conversations faltered as she gathered supplies, the silence spreading outward like ripples in still water. Some eyes held sympathy, others suspicion, a few burned with something colder, resentment that she'd disrupted their comfortable certainties about a man they thought they knew. Silas Reed's wife turned her back entirely, busying herself with ribbons she didn't need. The butcher's son stared too long, too hard, his loyalty to Jeremiah evident in the tight set of his jaw. The town had chosen sides without speaking them aloud, invisible lines drawn through Blackwater's single street, dividing those who could accept this new truth from those who refused. Morgan collected her purchases with steady hands, her face betraying nothing of the storm beneath. She'd weathered judgment before, in towns where being Catherine Ellis's fatherless daughter had marked her as somehow less. The whispers were familiar companions, no more welcome now than they had been then. As she stepped from the store, Eleanor Whitfield blocked her path. The town's oldest resident stood barely 5 feet tall, her back curved with age, but her eyes sharp as cut glass. Eleanor had seen Blackwater grow from nothing, had known every secret it tried to bury. She motioned Morgan to follow, leading her to the bench outside the closed barber shop, where Sunday's quiet stretched uninterrupted. Leonor spoke of Catherine then, of the bright young woman who had trained horses with a gentleness Blackwater had never seen before, of how the town had turned away when she needed them most, offering judgment instead of support when her pregnancy showed, of her own silence, the regret she'd carried for 20 years like stones in her pockets, weighing her down with each step. Eleanor offered no excuses, only recognition, perhaps the first honest acknowledgement Morgan had received since arriving. Later saddling Thunderstrike for their evening ride, Morgan found unexpected offerings left at the stable door, a jar of preserves with no name, a hand-knit blanket, a bag of carrots for the stallion. Small gestures from those who remembered Catherine with kindness, or those whose consciences had finally spoken louder than their loyalty to Jeremiah. Others made their positions equally clear. The farrier refused service when called to check Thunderstrike's shoes. The feed store owner charged her double without explanation. The diner saved the worst table for her, behind the kitchen door where grease-laden air made eating impossible. Through it all, Thunderstrike remained her constant, the one being in Blackwater who required no explanation. Each evening, Morgan leaned against his warm neck, breathing in his familiar scent, finding in his steady presence the strength to face another day of judgment. The property deed sat unopened on her dresser, both promise and question. To stay meant facing these divided opinions daily, building a life on contested ground. To leave meant abandoning what was rightfully hers, allowing Jeremiah's sin to send her running just as it had her mother. As Morgan watched the sun sink behind hills that now bore her name, the decision weighed heavier with each passing day. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Blackwater, the day Morgan Ellis posted notices across town. The auction barn would open Saturday at noon, not for business but for truth. The handwritten announcements appeared without fanfare on the general store bulletin board, the church door, the diner window, their presence as startling as Morgan's had been 3 weeks before. By mid-morning Saturday, vehicles lined the approach to the barn, curiosity proving stronger than loyalty or judgment. To wooden bleachers filled slowly, cautiously, as if the gathering might be a trap rather than an invitation. Eleanor Whitfield arrived first, claiming front row seats with determined dignity. Wade Connors stood by the far gate, arms crossed but eyes alert. Silas Reed and his wife settled near the middle, their expressions carefully neutral. Even those who had turned their backs on Morgan found reasons to attend, if only to witness whatever came next. Thunderstrike's arrival silenced the murmurs. The great stallion entered without halter or bridle, Morgan walking beside him with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. They moved to Center Arena, the exact spot where Jeremiah had issued his challenge 1 month earlier. The barn held its collective breath, the air charged with memory and possibility. Morgan stood straight-backed in the ring, not a challenger anymore, but something more permanent. She wore her mother's old denim jacket, faded but clean, turquoise beading, catching light from the high windows. Thunderstrike stood unnaturally still beside her, his presence both protection and proof. Here was the horse no one could tame, now calmly awaiting her words. Here was the daughter no one had known existed, now claiming her rightful place. Her voice carried clear and steady to the rafters as she spoke of staying, of transforming the auction house into a place where horses were trained with patience instead of broken with force, of honoring Catherine Ellis's methods and memory by creating something that valued truth over spectacle, of breaking the silence that had allowed her mother's story to be forgotten and her own existence to be denied. The crowd shifted in their seats as her words landed, some uncomfortable with the directness of her gaze, others nodding slowly as if waking from long sleep. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't even accusation anymore. This was foundation laying, the careful construction of something new from broken pieces of the past. Near the back entrance, partially hidden by shadow, Jeremiah Briggs stood motionless. He had arrived last, slipping in unannounced, his presence noticed but not acknowledged. He made no move to interrupt, to defend, to explain. For perhaps the first time in his life, he simply listened, bearing witness to the consequences of choices made 20 years before. As Morgan finished speaking, Thunderstrike moved forward unprompted, circling the arena once with proud, measured steps. The stallion, who had defied every rider, now moved in perfect partnership with the daughter of the woman who had first gentled him. It was demonstration more powerful than any words. What happens when truth replaces deception, when recognition replaces denial? Morgan left the arena as she had entered it, walking tall beside Thunderstrike. She passed Jeremiah, without looking at him, her eyes fixed on the future she was claiming. The crowd remained seated, silent, as the dust settled behind her. Something fundamental had shifted in Blackwater, something that could never be unspoken again. The first frost of autumn painted Blackwater silver, each blade of grass transformed by dawn's cold breath. Morgan Ellis stood on the porch of what was now truly her home, steam rising from her coffee mug as she watched the world crystallize into something beautiful and unfamiliar. 6 weeks had changed everything: the property, the town, herself. The auction barn had shed its reputation for spectacle and harsh handling. Horses now moved through its rings with dignity, valued for partnership rather than submission. Word spread through neighboring counties. Ellis training focused on patience, on understanding each animal's nature rather than breaking it. Some clients left, uncomfortable with the gentler methods. Others arrived, drawn by tales of the woman who spoke horses' language and honored their spirits. Morgan's days fell into rhythm. Mornings with thunderstrike, riding across frost-covered fields before the sun climbed high enough to melt the delicate patterns. Afternoons training in the arena. Evenings planning the renovations that would transform Jeremiah's legacy into something that honored Catherine's memory instead. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely, but they'd softened, curiosity replacing judgment as Blackwater slowly adjusted to truth living openly among them. This particular morning, returning from her ride, Morgan spotted something unexpected near the eastern fence line. A familiar silhouette bent over broken rails, work gloves, and determination evident even at distance. Jeremiah Briggs, hammering new posts into soil he no longer owned. He didn't look up as she approached, his focus entirely on the task before him, on wood and nails and physical labor that required no words. Thunderstrike's ears pricked forward at the sight of Jeremiah, but the stallion showed no fear, no anger. Morgan dismounted, letting the reins hang loose as she walked the final distance alone. Jeremiah straightened slowly, age evident in the careful movement of his back, in the lines carved deeper around his eyes. He nodded once in greeting, then returned to his work, hands steady on the fence he was rebuilding. No apology passed his lips, no plea for understanding or forgiveness. Instead, he spoke briefly of the property, which fences needed attention first, which creek tended to flood in spring, which field grew the sweetest hay. Practical knowledge passed down, not as peace offering, but as inheritance finally acknowledged. Morgan didn't thank him. She didn't promise forgiveness or relationship. She simply listened, then nodded once before walking back to where Thunderstrike waited. The stallion lowered his head as she approached, his breath warm against her palm. Behind her, the steady rhythm of Jeremiah's hammer continued, mending what had been broken. As she led Thunderstrike toward the barn, Morgan realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or even forgiving it completely. It was about building something new from the broken pieces, something honest that acknowledged both the damage and the possibility. The fence Jeremiah repaired would never be the original fence. It would be stronger, newer, bearing the marks of having once been broken but standing firm against whatever weather approached. Frost melted beneath the climbing sun, the silver world transforming back to familiar colors, yet something remained of that temporary beauty, the memory of how ordinary things could be transformed by time, by changing light, by the courage to see them differently. If you've enjoyed this story of redemption and healing, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales where truth breaks through silence. Stories like Morgan and Thunderstrike's remind us that second chances often come in unexpected forms, sometimes with 4 legs and a wild spirit. Thank you for riding alongside these characters, and I'll see you in the next video, where new stories wait to be told.